How disappointed are you that you will not be a 49er?
Not as disappointed as the 49ers will be that they didn't draft me.
He's one of the most prodigious and decorated quarterbacks in NFL history. A passing savant who began his pro career in the shadow of a football legend and ended up becoming one himself. Along the way, he also became one of football's most polarizing characters. A once universally beloved superstar who complicated his legacy with a late career fall from grace. Still, love him or hate him, there's no denying his place in the pantheon of history's greatest quarterbacks. From Butte College to Cal to the frozen tundra of Green Bay's Lambeau Field, this is the story behind Aaron Rodgers. Aaron Charles Rodgers was born December 2nd, 1983 in Chico, California, an unpretentious college town roughly 90 miles northeast of Sacramento. His father Ed had settled there after his stint as an offensive lineman at Chico State, and it wasn't long before Aaron, the second of three sons, developed a love for football himself. In fact, from essentially day one, Aaron's relationship with football hinged on obsessive. According to his father, by age 2, Aaron could sit and watch a full NFL game without fidgeting. By age 5, the young Rodgers was already football literate, while his physical skills, particularly his knack for throwing the football, far exceeded those of a normal preschooler. By the time he arrived at Chico's Pleasant Valley High School, Rodgers was a promising young quarterback, equipped with uncommon football sense and vision, superb mechanics, and a quick release. His ability to read opposing defenses and improvise at the line of scrimmage far exceeded his years. However, despite setting several school records in his senior year, including most passing yards in a season, Rodgers struggled to generate interest from the country's top college football programs. On account of his undersized physique, coupled with the fact that he played in the scouting dead zone of the Sacramento Valley, Rodgers wasn't even on the radar of most D1 programs. Frustrated over his lack of prospects, Rodgers spent the spring of his senior year rededicating himself to baseball, and with his fastball suddenly hitting 93 miles an hour, the teenager found himself at a crossroads. He could stick it out with his first love, football, even without any offers to play quarterback at a D1 school. He could try to make it as a baseball player, or he could leave sports behind and lean into his considerable academic strengths. Ultimately, thanks to an aggressive recruitment effort from the head coach at the local junior college, Rodgers decided to stick with football, committing to Butte College, a charter member of the California Community College Athletic Association. There, with the help of a timely growth spurt, Rodgers became the Roadrunners' starting QB as a freshman and immediately made it clear that he needed better competition. That year, Rodgers transformed Butte into one of the most fearsome junior college teams in the state, carrying the Roadrunners to a 10-1 record and a conference championship while earning first-team All-State honors. Along the way, Rodgers piqued the interest of Jeff Tedford, the head football coach at the University of California. Tedford had actually been watching tape of the Roadrunners to get a look at a promising tight end, but he found himself fixated on the quarterback who was picking defenses apart. Before long, Rodgers was a member of the Golden Bears, transferring from Butte to Cal after his freshman season and completing his circuitous route to D1 football. And the JUCO kid could hang. Rodgers took over as Cal's starting QB midway through his sophomore season and never looked back. Over the next 2 years, he blossomed into one of the most tantalizing quarterback prospects in the country, setting numerous school records and leading Cal in 2004 to what remains their highest end-of-season AP ranking this century. Suddenly, the kid who'd been overlooked by virtually every D1 program in the country had transformed into a consensus first-round NFL draft pick. So, rather than return to Cal for his senior season, Rodgers declared for the 2005 NFL Draft. And who held the first overall pick that year? The San Francisco 49ers, who happened to be the team Rodgers grew up cheering for and who just so happened to need a quarterback. And as the draft neared, it became clear that the 49ers were going to make their new franchise cornerstone either Rodgers or Alex Smith, the Utah product who'd gone 21-1 as a starter in college. It seemed too good to be true though, Rodgers being selected first overall by his childhood team, and as it turned out, it was. Come draft night, the 49ers decided to go with Smith. And as gutting as that blow was for Rodgers, who had grown up idolizing Joe Montana and Steve Young, things were about to get even more humbling. Rodgers, one of 6 college standouts who had headed to New York City to attend the draft in person, quickly found himself all alone in the green room at the Javits Center. By the 8th pick of the draft, the other 5 invitees had all been selected, but Rodgers was still waiting to hear his name called, and he kept on waiting. With so many high drafting teams either set at the quarterback position, up against the salary cap, or otherwise disinclined to take him, Rodgers fell out of the top 10, and then the top 15, and then the top 20.
A couple of weeks ago, Aaron, you were the clear-cut number 1. What's changed over that time?
Yeah, I wish I could tell you. I haven't changed anything. I think it's just perception of me or maybe needs of the teams at the spots. And I'm just, I'm not too worried. I'm excited about going to a team that wants me and making an impact right away.
It wasn't until the 24th pick of the first round that Rodgers finally heard his name called, and by the unlikeliest of teams.
With the 24th selection in the 2005 NFL Draft, the Green Bay Packers select Aaron Rodgers, quarterback from California.
At the time, of course, the Packers had a future Hall of Famer as their incumbent QB, which meant that Rodgers, who at one point had envisioned himself immediately becoming San Francisco's starting quarterback, was now headed for a backup role behind Brett Favre. If, however, Rodgers felt disheartened over his slide to 24 or the reality of his new career path in Green Bay, he certainly didn't let it show.
How disappointed are you that you will not be a 49er?
Not as disappointed as the 49ers will be that they didn't draft me.
And so began one of the most indelible careers in NFL history. Well, eventually. For his first 3 years with the Packers, Rodgers was virtually non-existent, playing only a few snaps per season as the backup to Favre, the 3-time MVP and 1-time Super Bowl champ who had fueled a franchise renaissance in the mid-90s and still had some gas in the tank in his late 30s. In fact, in 2007, Rodgers' third straight season as the heir apparent, a 38-year-old Favre finished second in MVP voting and propelled the Packers to a 13-3 season. But just when it seemed like Rodgers might remain in Favre's shadow forever, the aging icon gave his would-be successor, whose presence on the depth chart he had long resented by the way, an opening. Months after the Packers' heartbreaking overtime loss in the 2007 NFC Championship game, Favre announced his retirement after years of mounting speculation, paving the way for Rodgers to step into the spotlight. And although Favre famously unretired months later, the Packers were committed to Rodgers, who had spent his time as a backup studiously refining his skills in head coach Mike McCarthy's quarterback school and showing up the scout team in practice. So, roughly 4 weeks out from the start of the 2008 season, Green Bay traded the unretired Favre to the Jets, capping an acrimonious divorce between the franchise and its longtime linchpin and officially kicking off a new era, the Aaron Rodgers era. And in the face of considerable doubt and hostility from Packers fans, many of whom saw him as an unworthy successor to Favre, the 25-year-old wasted little time reminding everyone why he was once tabbed as a potential first overall pick. In his first career start, Rodgers showed off a dazzling complement of skills, completing 18 of his 22 pass attempts, throwing for a touchdown and sneaking in another one in a 24-19 victory over the Minnesota Vikings. It was a fitting introduction for Rodgers, who continued to impress all season long, even as the injury-riddled Packers finished 6-10. In his first season as a starter, Rodgers finished in the top 5 in the NFL in passing yards and passing touchdowns, posted the 6th highest QB rating, and led all quarterbacks with 4 rushing touchdowns. And while his future with the Packers had been perpetually murky through his first few years in Green Bay, the organization realized early on in that 2008 campaign that Rodgers was the future of the Packers, signing him to a contract extension that locked him up through 2014. But as impressive as he was in his first season as a starter, Rodgers was only scratching the surface. In 2009, Rodgers improved across the board, upping his completion rate while recording more passing yards, passing touchdowns, and rushing touchdowns than he had the season prior, and ultimately cementing himself as one of the NFL's best young quarterbacks. Between his throwing ability, decision-making, mobility, and creativity, Rodgers, it seemed, could do it all. And his increasingly elite play, coupled with a massive turnaround from the Packers' defense, re-established Green Bay as one of the top teams in football. Not only did Rodgers earn his first career Pro Bowl nod in 2009, but the Packers returned to the postseason, kicking off one of the most dominant stretches in franchise history. That dominance culminated quickly, too. In 2010, continued excellence from Rodgers propelled Green Bay back into the playoffs, and ultimately through one of the most impressive championship runs in recent history. Over his first 2 contests that postseason, Rodgers threw for 6 touchdowns and nearly 550 yards to lift Green Bay into the conference championship game. And though he wasn't at his best with the NFC title on the line, Rodgers and the Packers did enough to squeak past the Chicago Bears and into Super Bowl 45. There, Rodgers manhandled the NFL's best defense, throwing for 3 touchdowns and 304 yards to lead Green Bay to a 31-25 victory over the Pittsburgh Steelers and their first Super Bowl title since 1996. For his efforts, Rodgers was named Super Bowl MVP. More importantly, however, Rodgers had finally thrust himself out of Favre's great and lingering shadow. A half-decade after being drafted and 3 years after taking over as Green Bay's starting quarterback, Rodgers had silenced the skeptics and ultimately unburdened himself from the incessant comparisons and unfair expectations. He now had a Super Bowl ring, just like his predecessor, and Rodgers even had a Super Bowl MVP award, an honor Favre never received. Moreover, he was unequivocally one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL, the centerpiece of what looked like a burgeoning dynasty, and seemed more than capable of putting together one of the most special careers in football history. So how did Rodgers follow up his seminal 2010 campaign? By turning in his most impressive individual season yet. In fact, Rodgers' 2011 campaign remains one of the most incredible seasons by a quarterback in NFL history. That year, Rodgers broke the Packers' single-season records for passing yards and passing touchdowns and set a new NFL single-season record for QB rating. His brilliance not only propelled Green Bay to a franchise record 15 wins, as well as the first division title of the Rodgers era, but they also earned Rodgers his first career MVP award. Rodgers and the Packers, it seemed, were inevitable. Their continued dominance in the wake of their Super Bowl title evoked the New England Patriots of the early aughts, and with Rodgers having seemingly discovered a new gear, the Packers figured to be an intractable juggernaut for a long, long time. Except they weren't. Green Bay's 2011 title defense was thwarted in their very first postseason game, with the Packers' defense getting shredded by Eli Manning and the New York Giants. For his part, Rodgers turned in his worst game of the season by QB rating, committing a pair of turnovers en route to a stunning defeat. At the time, it seemed like nothing more than a blip, a bad early round loss against a Giants team of destiny. As the years passed, however, that loss took on a greater historical significance. It marked the beginning of a troubling pattern for the Packers. From that point onward, as much as Rodgers and the Packers continued to dominate during the regular season, Green Bay invariably came up short in the playoffs. From 2012 through 2016, the Packers made the playoffs every year, including 4 times as division champs, but never once made it past the conference championship game. During that span, Rodgers earned another 4 Pro Bowl nods, a second MVP award, and a host of historical distinctions, including becoming the fastest QB to 250 passing touchdowns and the fastest to 30,000 passing yards. Meanwhile, he also landed a 9-figure contract extension from the Packers. But his increasingly rarefied resume only made Green Bay's mounting playoff disappointments all the more devastating. By his mid-30s, Rodgers had cemented himself as one of the best quarterbacks ever to play the game, but his shoddy postseason record was an undeniable stain on his legacy. And even as the faces around Rodgers changed, and the gray in his beard grew more pronounced, the Packers' postseason futility persisted. In 2019, after 2 straight forgettable seasons marred by an injury to Rodgers and coaching staff turnover, the Packers enjoyed a renaissance under new head coach Matt LaFleur. That year, Green Bay enjoyed their finest season since 2011, finishing 13-3, thanks in large part to Rodgers' 8th career Pro Bowl campaign. The new regime, however, couldn't prevent the Packers from meeting their customary fate. After sneaking past the Seahawks in the divisional round, Green Bay got thumped by the 49ers in the NFC Championship game, and the ensuing season followed a similar script. Despite another MVP campaign from Rodgers, who, at the age of 37, threw a career-high 48 touchdowns and posted the second highest single-season QB rating ever, the Packers season ended yet again in the NFC Championship game, where Rodgers and company were bested by Tom Brady and the eventual Super Bowl champion Tampa Bay Buccaneers. To his credit, Rodgers far outplayed Brady in the loss, throwing for 3 touchdowns and nearly 350 yards, but he nevertheless slumped off the field with a lifetime 1-4 record in conference championship games. Still, while that second straight NFC Championship loss may have enlarged the lone stain on his football resume, it was Rodgers' behavior in the year that followed that reshaped his reputation in earnest. In 2021, as the COVID-19 pandemic upended every facet of everyday life, Rodgers' integrity and credibility took a profound hit after he misled reporters about his vaccination status, violated league protocols pertaining to COVID safety, and later began peddling misinformation about the virus.
So this idea that it's the pandemic of the unvaccinated is just a total lie. If the vaccine is so great, then how come people are still getting COVID and spreading COVID and unfortunately dying from COVID?
His irresponsible behavior sparked intense backlash, which Rodgers dismissed as a byproduct of cancel culture and the woke mob. Ultimately, as he leaned harder into his anti-vax convictions, Rodgers torpedoed the immense likability he had cultivated over the years through his on-field excellence, charming personality, and smarts, which he had previously parlayed into a stint as a guest host on Jeopardy! Meanwhile, in addition to losing fans, Rodgers also lost corporate sponsors on account of his COVID-related posturing, and the entire saga was so discrediting in the eyes of one football writer that he vowed not to vote for Rodgers for the MVP award. But while his off-field behavior made him one of football's most polarizing figures, his increasing divisiveness didn't at all diminish his effectiveness on the field. Amid all the controversy, Rodgers was still sublime in 2021, leading the NFL in QB rating for a second straight year, en route to a second straight MVP award, the 4th of his career. But although that award further solidified him as a future Inner Circle Hall of Famer, with more MVP awards than every player in history except for Peyton Manning, Rodgers remained unable that postseason to dispel his unflattering reputation for coming up short in the playoffs. Following a 13-4 regular season, Rodgers and the Packers didn't win a single postseason game, mustering only 10 points in a divisional round loss to the 49ers. And that defeat was as familiar as it was momentous. Seemingly, with that underwhelming effort against San Francisco, Rodgers' time as one of the game's most dangerous quarterbacks came to an end. After deciding to return to Green Bay for an 18th season in 2022 and finalizing a contract extension that made him the highest paid player in the league, Rodgers' performance tailed off dramatically. In fact, at 39 years old and with no elite receivers to lean on, Rodgers was practically unrecognizable. He couldn't throw the ball downfield with any regularity, posting career lows in adjusted yards gained per attempt and yards per game. He also made mistakes like never before, throwing a dozen interceptions after totaling 13 picks over the previous 3 seasons. Ultimately, he not only put up the worst adjusted total QB rating of his career, but he managed one of the worst marks in the entire league, behind the likes of Matt Ryan and Andy Dalton. And despite a valiant late-season rally, Rodgers and the Packers finished below 500 for the season and missed the playoffs for the first time since 2018. And so, in the wake of a humbling season in which he looked mortal for the first time in his career, Rodgers found himself at a crossroads once again. He could return to Green Bay despite the Packers' uninspiring short-term outlook. He could, like Brady before him, facilitate a late career move to another franchise after spending his entire career in one uniform. Or he could hang up his cleats and head into retirement with his 1 Super Bowl ring and a singularly impressive resume. A resume highlighted by 4 MVP awards and 10 Pro Bowl nominations. Not to mention the highest touchdown to interception ratio and QB rating in NFL history. It was a decision Rodgers ruminated on long and hard, at one point even going on a darkness retreat in an attempt to gain clarity. And while Rodgers, as of this writing, has yet to reveal whether or not he's reached the end of his football journey, his place in the annals of the sport has long been secure. Whether he returns to Green Bay, winds up in New York or Las Vegas, or calls it quits, Rodgers will ultimately go down as one of the best quarterbacks ever to play the game and one of the most unforgettable stars the NFL has ever seen. Thanks for watching. If you like this video and want to see more content like this, hit that subscribe button.